So Andy, I was really fascinated to look on your website that, and this might seem a bit of a heavy way to start, but your quoting of G.K. Chesterton, noted British writer, and his views about literature and particularly the ideas around nonsense. And there's one line that sort of sets it up pretty well for today, which is to do with the claim that there must always be rich moral soil for any great aesthetic growth. I'm just wondering, when you look back to your own initial experience with literature, and particularly there's been a bit of a theme today with grandmas, as to where you think you first encountered some kind of notion of there being a moral dimension to the stories that were being told.
Yeah, well, I was lucky enough to have a grandmother who had a copy of the German children's classic Struwwel Peter, and if anyone has anyone read that book or survived that book? It's a terrifying book of children who do the wrong thing. It always starts the same way, these merry stories and funny pictures is what it says on the cover, and the parent says don't do something, and then the child does it and suffers awful consequences. There's the dreadful story of Harriet and the matches. The mother says, mind now what I say, don't play with the matches while I'm away. But as soon as she goes out, Harriet picks up the matches, runs around the house with them, sets her dress on fire, and ends the story as a small pile of ashes.
I had mine was Hilaire Belloc's Cautionary Tales.
Yes,
the same sort of thing. And I remember the first story about a boy who let go of his nurse's hand and was eaten by a lion. And there's this picture of this rather chubby zookeeper saying, "Down, sir, put it down," and all that remains is the head.
Yeah.
So this was the German precursor probably to that, which you were introduced to by your grandmother.
Yeah, and I remember my sisters and I would get to the house, and all I wanted to do was see this book, because it was a combination of both terror and hilarity, that the consequences were so out of proportion to the crime. There was the little story of Suck a Thumb, who his mother said, "If you suck your thumb while I'm away, a great tall tailor always comes," and to little boys who sucks their thumbs and cuts their thumbs clean off, and then you know they never grow again. But as Mum has scarcely turned her back, the thumb was in, alack, alack. And sure enough, a man with long red legs and a big pair of scissors comes and cuts both of his thumbs off. And at the end of the story, he's just standing there. And I can still remember it says, "Mama comes home and Conrad stands and looks quite sad and shows his hands. 'Ah,' said Mama, 'I knew he'd come, to naughty little sucker thumb.'" That's all the sympathy he's getting. She did tell him.
I think a lot of us are introduced to stories, at least, through fairy tales and things of this kind. And I've always been fascinated by the fact that there are some very dark themes which are explored in these things, but are produced in a way, in a sense, that makes it safe for us to encounter them, because it is that extension beyond what we might think to be reasonable which actually does that.
And I think we forget, because I remember studying Hansel and Gretel very closely when I was beginning to grapple with the idea of how to write books that were really going to engage kids. And I looked at Hansel and Gretel, that lovely fairy tale in which we see parental abandonment, we see a cannibalism, an old woman trying to eat a boy, we see murder as his sister pushes her into the oven, and deception, and then the snivelling cowardice of the father, who then accepts them back home because it's okay now, your stepmother's died, and he benefits from all the largesse of the witch's house, which I always thought there's something wrong there. But I think in that, as they confront those awful things, we see them rise to the challenge and show resilience and courage. And you cannot have resilience and courage without an adequate opponent. And that is why you need darkness in any story that's going to have any sort of resonance for people.
There's also, in the same part of piece of Chesterton's which I quoted, this beautiful line that a thing that cannot be completely wonderful so long as it remains sensible. And that the world must not only be the tragic, romantic and religious, it must be nonsensical also. Now, clearly, your website is a product of you making some kind of editor's choice as to what to include or not. So these sorts of things are pretty important. And you are famous in your work. You've written this yourself about asking what is the worst thing that can happen to a person, and then you make it happen.
Yeah.
So are you? I don't want to sort of unpack too much the craft that you're using, but you started off with the stories your grandmother told. You've talked now again about the general capacity within fairy tales and things to introduce children into a quite deep and troubling world, but in a way that's safe and allows some positive. Is this partly what's going on in your mind when you're starting to look at the extension of what you're going to do in your own books?
Yeah, well, I observed, I went from Struwwel Peter through Dr. Seuss, who had that amazing playfulness with both imagery and words.
Alice in Wonderland, you mentioned.
Alice in Wonderland was hugely influential, still is.
Yeah.
And then I went through Mad Magazine, the works of Enid Blyton, because she would just get out of the way and tell you a story. And she employed the same device, which I noticed, which was to get the parents out of the way really early and get the kids into that wishing chair and into a world of heightened danger before the first chapter was over. And that's all I wanted, was to get into that world of danger. And then that got mixed up with Mad Magazine, Monty Python's Flying Circus.
And Alice Cooper.
And Alice Cooper. I mean, what a great vaudevillian.
Yeah.
He was a great showman, and he played with all these, dark themes in the most delightfully funny way. And I always saw the funny side of all of this. So when I went to write, naturally this came out. And I knew Roald Dahl's work as well, and you'll notice most of his characters are orphans, and he gets rid of the parents in the most ridiculous ways. James and the Giant's Peach, you might remember his parents are killed by a charging rhinoceros in the middle of London. And I think he's saying we don't need the parents. It doesn't matter why, we just need this boy in a situation where he can show resilience. And so I noticed from talking to kids and telling them stories, that's when they lean forward, is when the kid is doing something dangerous or in a dangerous situation. And, I made a whole book out of this called The Bad Book, where everything was bad and only characters did bad things. And there was a famous example, which I got into a lot of trouble for, about a boy who says, "Mummy, can I run across this busy 6-lane highway with my eyes shut?" And the mother says, "I don't know, that sounds a bit dangerous." And he goes, "Please." And she says, "Okay, but be careful." And he says, "Thanks, Mum, can count me down." And she counts him down, and he runs across the road and gets hit by a car. And she just says, "Oops," and walks the other way. Now that story is called Bad Mummy and the Busy 6-Lane Highway. It was incredibly misunderstood because some people said, "Well, you're encouraging kids to run across the road with their eyes shut." And I said, "Look, no, I'm not. If you notice what happened to that kid, he got hit by a car. That is a very serious road safety message." And also, it's about the mother who should have said no. She is a bad mother because she was just too free.
Did you worry when you were writing this as maybe this was one where you were going to be criticised, and did you temper it in any way?
Both Terry Denton is my illustrator, long-term, and partner in crime. And in fact, The Bad Book was the first book we came together, rather than just having him around the margins of the book. We said, let's write it together and blend our talents. And The Bad Book is what came out. So we were totally out of control, and we were actually looking for where the edge was, because we'd been, with each subsequent Just book, we'd been pushing the limits of what was acceptable. But the kids were egging us on, and a lot of the parents were egging us on too, after their initial, "Oh, I don't know about this." They recognised themselves in the characters of the parents, because my parents, when Andy pretends he's dead to get out of going to school, he goes that one step too far, "I'm dead." And his mum and dad, instead of making him get out of bed and go to school, pretend to think that he's dead and then dig a hole in the backyard and drop him in.
It's always a good philosophical ploy, take people entirely seriously and see what happens. Yeah.
And so he takes it as a challenge, and he said, I'm not going to admit that I'm not dead. And then they fill in the hole and said, what's the worst thing that could happen next? I figured, well, he's totally covered. And then the dog jumps in and digs him out. And he jumps up, Mum, Dad, I'm just tricking. And his dad has a heart attack and dies. And so, this is good, we're in big territory here. And he runs to give his dad mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, because ultimately Andy is ethical and moral, and he is concerned about what happens to people inadvertently, well, too late, obviously. He goes to give him mouth-to-mouth. His mother is screaming at him, get away from him, you blood-sucking zombie freak. And he thinks, I've driven my mother insane, I've killed my father. It's really Oedipus. And then his dad starts laughing, and his dad, and the father says, just tricking. So that father is quite out of control too, but I believe stories should be for everyone, and stories are where things go wrong, and that's where we need to be.
There's a great line, a kind of a comment about the bad book, and I'll just get it right, it says, it teaches them to think outside the square. And I was saying to Andy before, I always feel bad for squares and boxes, that they're always the paradigm that you have to think, why not think outside a triangle or something? But anyway.
That's how philosophers spend their time. It's not a million miles from what I do.
But that is actually the core of ethics. I mean, the thing about living an ethical life as opposed to a purely conventional moral life is it goes back to Socrates and the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living. That for a human being, we have this capacity to transcend instinct and desire and to make conscious choices. And I think Sue Knight was talking about it, David Seathouse was too. And I think then that if children's literature is not only confronting children with the capacity to face the darker side of the world and to find within themselves a resilience to cope, but also to go beyond that and to think outside the box, square, triangle, whatever it is, then it's doing one of the most fundamental things that you would ever want for an ethical person to develop. And I just wonder how you, when you had that comment being made, is it something you said, yes, that's exactly what I was trying to do, or was it an unexpected achievement?
Yeah, definitely, because, well, unexpected achievement, because my first aim is to entertain the reader. There's nothing else going on. And I consciously started with that. I said, I'm not going to teach a message as such, because it turns kids off. The minute they smell something worthy is trying to be slipped in there.
Yeah, I agree.
We're out of the room. And I was like that. That's how I know that. But so I thought, we're just going to entertain them, give them the most wild situations. And just by dropping them into, what you do is you give them the situation, a bit like the $100 note episode. It reminded me of the story in the latest book, Just Doomed, Andy's handbag, where he has to get his mother's handbag from laundrette, where she's left it. She's in a queue at the post office, which is never going to end. And she says, can you just get me this bag? And he says, but Mum, I can't be seen carrying a lady's handbag. And she says, just do it. And so he's carrying the lady's handbag. The worst thing happens is that his girlfriend, or the girl he's always trying to impress, is coming on the street. And so I always get to, when I'm telling the kids this, to say, what would you do? And I figured my reaction would be to drop the handbag and disown it, and deal with the girl. And she invites him out on a date, and it's all gone really, really well. And then she sees the handbag and she says, oh, someone's lost their handbag. And now, should Andy admit that it's his handbag? He can't do that because he'll lose face. And she says, we've got to take it to the police station. And he said, oh, I can't take my own mother's handbag to the police station. It's just a simple task. But then, he wants to impress the girl, so he goes along with it. They go to the police station. Worst thing ever, there's a wanted sign for people who've been stealing handbags, and it's got a picture that looks a bit like him. So the police detain him for questioning. And there's a moment where they leave him alone and he sees the handbag and he thinks, I could steal the handbag and run back to the post office and none of this will happen. And of course, he steals the handbag from the police station, and I won't spoil the end, but there is an exciting chase with gunfire. And But I don't think you have to give the kids a message, well, you should never, steal. It's obvious, and I trust them to know that this character is funny because he is making often wrong choices. And that's the key with the Bad Book, was the kids know implicitly that you should not run across roads, but that in a book, fictional characters may run across roads and we can have a great time watching them because no one is actually getting hurt.
I think this is one of the really important insights in our work, particularly through a program we've recently introduced into New South Wales called Primary Ethics, which is for children who don't go to scripture classes. They can choose to do ethics classes as one of the options. There was a lot of debate, very heated political debate, about whether children were capable of actually dealing with quite complex ethical questions that might arise. And my experience, and I think the view of many others involved, has been that, as you described, there is a capacity, quite a sophisticated capacity, to read into the world without too much direct intention that something like bullying is wrong, or that you don't run across roads and things of that kind. Yep. So going back to where we started, in a sense, with the Chesterton quotation about there needing to be a moral soil, clearly your entertaining is your first view, but do you think writers need to be aware of that?
Well, strangely enough, I gave myself permission in the first book, Just Tricking, for him to play any practical joke, no matter how horrendous or how mean. But I knew in the end it had to backfire on him in the biggest possible way. And so that was my moral centre, if you like.
Kind of a moral economy where eventually
and what if the equation has to balance? Otherwise the kids would say, well, that's not a very nice story. He's a horrible character. He got laughter out of someone else's suffering. Now, he can do that, but then if he then suffers even more, we're okay with it. The equation is balanced. You may not be able to say that, but you know it in a good story, whether it's balanced.
And your readers clearly relate to that themselves in terms of how they're picking up on that situation. Yeah,
and no one would take Andy in the books as a great moral character.
As an exemplar, you're saying they're not going to confuse that this is the kind of thing you ought to do.
Yeah,
you're recommending.
Because he's, like any comic character, is often inflexible, and I think this is one of the great gifts of humour, and one of the reasons why it is a great teacher, inadvertently, is a comic character lacks the ability to react flexibly to challenges. If you take Basil Fawlty from the Fawlty Towers, he is inflexibly angry, and inflexibly snobbish. And whatever situation, you know it's going to go bad because he just cannot just pull back for a moment, assess the situation sensibly. And we hate going on the journey with him, but we love it at the same time.
And looking beyond your own work, in children's literature more generally, what are you seeing now in terms of the really exciting things that are happening that are contributing to the lives of younger people, and how they form the sense of themselves as ethical beings particularly?
I take a pretty optimistic view of where reading is at the moment. I think we have more books for more different kids than we ever had. I mean, I had Enid Blyton and that was it. And she wrote many different books, but now there's fantasy, humour is well catered for in a way that it wasn't 20 years ago, which is part of why I started writing, because I thought, why is no one taking humour seriously? And now we have the rise of Wimpy Kid, which I think is wonderful, because he is airing all of the moral problems, the embarrassments, and it's a very honest account of childhood.
Would you ever, or have you ever been tempted to write the kind of like the Gothic style children's fairy tale without the humour and things, which is just the kind of the Hansel and Gretel?
No, I couldn't do it without humour.
Do you think it would work these days? Do you think there's a place for it still? Or
for fear and horror, there always is a market, and we've seen vampires and zombies and now, taking over the world. Which I like to think I started with zombie bums from Uranus back in 2002, but zombies have never really gone away because they create their own ethical problems of are they humans or are they beasts, or
And for yourself, I mean, with sitting down with Denton when you did the first Bad Book, you said, look, we're going to really push it to the limit. Have you had to self-censor ever, where you've said, no, there's a step there that I won't go to beyond?
Yep, and in fact, I know what the step was that was too far. It was a silly little rhyme based on the rhymes in Australia that were in around the 40s, Little Willie. A lot of really old people remember them. Little Willie fell in the fire in his best of sashes and was burned to ashes. I can't remember the end of that. No, but I wrote my own Little Willie poems. Little Willie took a match and set fire to the cat. Said, Little Willie, as it burned, I guess the cat hates that. Now that was an instance of quite dark, absurd humour. It was obvious the cat hated it, but because it was running away. And then I wrote, Little Willie took a match and set fire to his bum. Said Little Willie as it burnt, that was pretty dumb. Little Willie took a match and set fire to his head. Said Little Willie as it burnt, soon I will be dead. Now the biggest outrage was not to his bum or his head, but to this fictional cat.
Yeah.
And so I was getting accused of every instance of cat cruelty that had happened that year and to come. And so I took it out and had him set fire to his elbow or something.
So it was published, the original publication?
As a cat, yeah. But it was upsetting so many people, and that was not my intention. So I said, let's forget about the stupid cat. It doesn't even exist, and I do not condone cat cruelty.
And do you think the response that you got was an unreasonable one? That was it from adults who were less sensible than the children who would have understood it by reading it?
Mentioning John Cleese, they found out this in A Fish Called Wanda when you squashed dogs. There's a character who tries to kill dogs all the time, and they took two different takes of it, one with butcher's entrails all around the brick and one without. And when they showed the butcher's entrails, everyone was so outraged they stopped laughing and said this is the most appalling film ever. But if you changed the dogs to horrible little, manicured things and had no guts, then it was okay. So it's just a question of balance, and comedians often get it wrong.
Yeah, and it's a curious thing too that if it had been a person, a human, it might not have been nearly as outrageous as it was because it was a dog.
He still exists in print today as setting fire to himself, and no one cares. Yeah, no one cares.
Well, that's probably a good note to end on before we have lunch with squashed dogs, burning bums, and all the rest.
Sorry,
Andy. I think it's a real art that you bring to bear in that, and obviously the ability to deploy humour in the way you do, without a consciously serious intent, but nonetheless addressing these things. I think you're carrying on in a great tradition going back, for the dawn of human beings telling stories to children. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in thanking Andy Griffith.
Thank you.